If you love creepy, true road trip horror stories, you're in for a thrill. Watch till the end, and don't forget to comment below with which city you're watching from. Enjoy the ride. Road trips are supposed to be freeing, a journey into the unknown, with nothing but the open road ahead and adventure in your heart. But what happens when the unknown becomes something terrifying, something unexplainable? These aren't urban legends or campfire tales. These are real accounts of ordinary people who found themselves face to face with unimaginable horrors on the road. From ghostly passengers who vanish without a trace to isolated rest stops hiding unspeakable dangers, these 5 stories will make you question the safety of even the most familiar highways. Tonight, buckle up for the most disturbing road trip horror stories you've ever heard. Stories that might make you reconsider your next journey into the night. It was supposed to be a simple drive home. Jason, a 29-year-old salesman, was heading back from a business trip late at night, cruising along an isolated stretch of highway. The snow fell lightly, blanketing the dark road ahead. As he adjusted the radio, static filled the car, drowning out the music. He was about to turn it off when he saw her, a lone figure standing by the roadside, her thumb outstretched. Jason hesitated. Picking up a hitchhiker in the middle of nowhere was not on his to-do list, but something about her pale, desperate face struck a chord. Against his better judgment, he pulled over. She climbed in silently, her frail frame shivering under a thin coat. "Where are you headed?" Jason asked, breaking the silence. She didn't look at him, only whispered, "Just drive." As they continued, strange things began to happen. The radio crackled louder, and the air inside the car grew icy. Jason glanced at his passenger through the rearview mirror, only to see an empty seat where she should have been. Jason slammed the brakes, his heart pounding. He looked back, fully expecting to see her crouched behind the seat or hiding under a jacket. The car was empty. The door locks clicked suddenly, and the dashboard lights flickered, plunging him into near darkness. Shaken, Jason decided to drive to the nearest town. Just as he reached for his phone to call someone, anyone, his headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was her again, the same hitchhiker, staring at him with hollow eyes. She raised her hand slowly and pointed down a side road. Against all reason, Jason turned. The road twisted through dense woods, the snow falling heavier. He glanced at his passenger seat, now occupied by her once more. She looked out the window, her face expressionless, her voice a whisper. Almost there. Jason's panic deepened as the road turned into a narrow trail. His GPS was glitching, showing no trace of the path he was on. The woman's presence became more unsettling. When Jason tried to ask questions, she replied cryptically, mentioning a place she needed to return to, an old motel, long abandoned, where she had unfinished business. Jason reluctantly pulled up to the motel, its sign barely visible under years of grime. The building looked like it hadn't seen a guest in decades. She stepped out without a word and began walking toward the darkened structure. Jason debated leaving but felt compelled to follow. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and decay. The hitchhiker led him to room 13 and stopped. "He's here," she whispered. Before Jason could ask who, the door creaked open. The room was empty except for a photograph lying on the bed. It showed a family, a young girl with the same pale face as the hitchhiker, standing between a man and a woman. The man's face had been violently scratched out. Jason suddenly felt a presence behind him. Turning, he saw the shadow of a man towering over the hitchhiker. Her eyes filled with terror as she screamed, "You shouldn't have come back!" The shadow surged forward, and the room's temperature plummeted. Jason bolted out of the motel, his heart racing, but the hitchhiker's screams echoed in his ears. When he looked back, the building was gone, replaced by an empty field. His car, however, was still there. As he drove away, the hitchhiker reappeared in the rearview mirror, her eyes locking onto his. "You can't leave," she said softly, her voice laced with sorrow. Jason felt his car veer, as if pulled by an invisible force. The steering wheel grew ice-cold under his hands, and his surroundings blurred into a dizzying fog. He awoke hours later, parked by the roadside. The hitchhiker was gone, but his car carried strange marks, handprints on the frosted windows, and scratches on the interior, as though something had clawed at it from the inside. Jason made it home, but his life was never the same. Night after night, he saw her in his dreams, standing by the roadside, her hollow eyes following him wherever he went. He avoided driving altogether, yet he could never escape her haunting presence. Months later, Jason learned the motel had burned down decades ago. A man had set the fire, killing his wife and daughter. The hitchhiker, it seemed, had been trying to return home, to confront the one who had taken everything from her. The story ends with another traveler driving along the same road, spotting a pale figure by the roadside. The cycle begins again. Samantha and her best friend, Rachel, were halfway through their cross-country road trip when exhaustion set in. It was nearing midnight, and the long, empty highway seemed to stretch endlessly. When they spotted a sign for a rest stop a few miles ahead, they decided to pull over for a quick break. The rest stop was eerily quiet, the parking lot nearly empty, save for a single car parked near the entrance. The building was a squat, dimly lit structure, surrounded by dense woods. Samantha parked her car under the flickering light of a lamppost, and they both stepped out, grateful for the chance to stretch their legs. Inside, the air was stale, and the fluorescent lights hummed faintly. Rachel headed toward the restroom, while Samantha lingered by the vending machines. As she waited, her gaze drifted to the security monitor above the counter. Her blood ran cold. The grainy black and white footage showed Rachel entering the restroom, but a tall, shadowy figure followed closely behind. Samantha froze, staring at the monitor. The figure was too tall to be another traveler, its movements unnaturally smooth and deliberate. Panic set in as she debated whether to call out to Rachel or investigate herself. Gathering her courage, Samantha pushed open the restroom door. The lights inside flickered, casting long, ominous shadows. "Rachel?" she called out. There was no response. As she ventured further in, Samantha found Rachel's bag on the counter, but her friend was nowhere in sight. The stall doors creaked slightly, as if someone, or something, was moving just out of view. Suddenly, the restroom door slammed shut behind her, and the lights went out entirely. Samantha's phone flashlight revealed claw-like scratches running down the walls. A faint whisper echoed through the room, repeating a single word: "Stay." When the lights flickered back on, Rachel was standing at the sink, staring into the mirror. Her reflection didn't move. Samantha grabbed Rachel's arm and dragged her out of the restroom, but her friend seemed dazed, muttering incoherently about someone watching her. Outside, the rest stop seemed different. The single car they had seen earlier was gone, and the woods surrounding the lot felt alive, their dark silhouettes swaying despite the lack of wind. As they hurried back to their car, they found deep, claw-like marks etched into the vehicle's doors. Rachel's behavior grew more erratic. She kept glancing over her shoulder, claiming she could see the shadowy figure lurking just beyond the trees. Desperate for answers, Samantha scoured the rest stop for any sign of other people. In the manager's office, she discovered an old notebook filled with scribbled entries. It belonged to a former employee who wrote about strange occurrences, disappearing travelers, shadowy figures in the woods, and voices calling from the mirrors. The last entry read, "They never leave. Once you see them, they're always with you." Rachel began to scream, her voice echoing through the empty rest stop. Samantha ran back to find her sitting in the car, her hands clutching her head. "He's here," Rachel whispered. "He's inside me." The shadowy figure appeared, stepping out from the edge of the woods. Its form was barely human, with elongated limbs and glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. Samantha started the car, but it wouldn't budge, as if the figure's presence was holding it in place. Rachel's body convulsed violently, her eyes rolling back as the shadowy figure grew closer. Samantha screamed at her to hold on, trying desperately to force the car into gear. Just as the figure reached Rachel's side of the car, she opened the door and stepped out, her movements stiff and unnatural. Samantha begged her to get back in, but Rachel ignored her, walking toward the figure. The closer she got, the more her body seemed to contort, as though she were being pulled apart. Samantha grabbed a flashlight and ran after her, but the shadowy figure vanished, taking Rachel with it. The woods erupted with whispers, each voice calling Samantha's name. She stumbled back to the car, now covered in frost despite the warm night. The engine roared to life on its own, and the car sped off, leaving her paralyzed with fear. Samantha eventually made it to a nearby gas station, incoherent and trembling. When the authorities searched the rest stop, there was no trace of Rachel or the shadowy figure. The manager's office was empty, the notebook gone, and the claw marks on the car vanished. Samantha couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Months later, while driving on a different highway, she caught a glimpse of Rachel's face in her rearview mirror. Only, it wasn't Rachel. It was her reflection, twisted into a horrifying grin. The story ends with a shot of the rest stop at night, its lights flickering. A lone traveler pulls in, unaware of the shadowy figure watching from the edge of the woods. It was supposed to be an uneventful road trip. Mark and his brother Eric were driving through the open desert, the kind of landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. The sun had set hours ago, leaving only the moonlight to illuminate the lonely highway. Somewhere along the way, they passed a figure standing by the side of the road, a man in a tattered jacket, arm raised, thumb out. Mark slowed the car slightly, but Eric shook his head. "Don't stop," he warned. "This late at night? It's not safe." Mark reluctantly drove on, but in the rearview mirror, he saw the hitchhiker turn and watch their car disappear into the distance. Later, as the highway wound through a canyon, Eric spotted something ahead. His voice was tense. "Mark, isn't that the same guy?" Standing in the middle of the road was the hitchhiker, staring directly at them. Mark swerved, narrowly avoiding the man, and sped down the road. When they looked back, the hitchhiker was gone. Eric tried to rationalize it. "It's just your nerves. He probably took a shortcut through the canyon." But the uneasy feeling lingered. The highway was deserted, with no exits or side roads for miles. How could the hitchhiker have gotten ahead of them? As they pressed on, the air in the car grew heavy. The radio, which had been playing faint music, began to crackle with static. A faint voice whispered through the interference, but neither of them could make out the words. Stopping at a gas station to refuel, Mark noticed something chilling. On the dusty back window of their car, someone had traced a single word with their finger. "Wait." They asked the attendant if anyone else had been around, but the man shook his head. "You're the first people I've seen all night." Shaken, the brothers decided to drive straight through the night to their destination. But no matter how far they drove, the hitchhiker kept appearing, always ahead of them, standing by the roadside, his face obscured by shadows. They tried to rationalize it, convincing themselves it was just a hallucination from exhaustion. But then, Eric saw the hitchhiker's reflection in the side mirror, sitting in the back seat of the car. When he turned around, there was nothing there. At a rest stop, Eric found an old newspaper abandoned on a bench. The front page was yellowed with age, but the headline sent chills down his spine. "Mysterious disappearances along desert highway. Lone hitchhiker suspected." The article detailed a series of cases spanning decades, all involving travelers who vanished without a trace. Witnesses reported seeing the same man, a hitchhiker with a tattered jacket, standing by the roadside before each disappearance. The brothers realized they were reliving a ghost story. But this wasn't just a tale, it was happening to them. The hitchhiker's appearances grew more frequent and more aggressive. He no longer waited by the roadside. He was on the road, in their mirrors, and increasingly, in their minds. They heard his voice over the static-filled radio, whispering warnings and cryptic messages. "You can't escape me." Eric, panicking, insisted they take a detour. But every road they chose seemed to loop back to the same stretch of highway. The hitchhiker's figure was always there, his presence inescapable. Mark finally snapped. "We have to confront him," he said, pulling the car to a stop. When they saw the hitchhiker standing ahead, he grabbed a flashlight and stepped out of the car, ignoring Eric's protests. The hitchhiker didn't move as Mark approached. When the beam of the flashlight illuminated his face, Mark froze. The man's features were grotesque, his skin pale and cracked, his eyes hollow voids. And then he spoke, his voice layered with echoes. "You should have stopped when I asked." Eric screamed as the hitchhiker lunged toward Mark. The flashlight dropped, and the darkness swallowed them. Eric waited in the car, too terrified to move. Minutes felt like hours, but Mark never returned. The headlights flickered, and the car radio crackled to life. Eric's heart raced as Mark's voice came through the static. "Drive! Don't look back." He obeyed, speeding down the highway, but the rearview mirror revealed something horrifying. The hitchhiker was sitting in the passenger seat, his empty eyes fixed on Eric. The story ends with Eric's car abandoned in the desert, the doors open, and the engine still running. A traveler driving the same route weeks later sees a hitchhiker standing by the roadside, his thumb raised, wearing a familiar tattered jacket. It started as a favor. Lisa, a college student heading home for winter break, posted on a rideshare app looking for someone to split the cost of gas for the long drive back to her hometown. By the next morning, she had a response from someone named Clara, a profile with no photo and minimal details, but with a high rating. Clara agreed to meet Lisa at a rest stop just outside the city. When Lisa arrived, the parking lot was empty, except for a single figure standing in the shadows. The woman introduced herself as Clara. She was pale, her hood drawn low over her face, and carried no bags. As they hit the highway, Lisa tried making conversation, but Clara's responses were short and monotone. Instead, Clara seemed more interested in the road ahead, rarely blinking, her eyes fixed on the horizon. When Lisa glanced at her GPS, she noticed something strange. The location pin kept resetting. Every few minutes, the estimated time to her destination grew longer, as if they were driving in circles. The real horror began when Lisa's car radio, previously turned off, crackled with static. Over the noise, a faint whisper emerged. "You shouldn't have picked her up." Lisa tried to ignore the creeping dread in her chest, focusing on the road and hoping the drive would end quickly. The highway grew darker, and the exits they passed didn't match anything on her GPS. She felt like they were being swallowed by the night. At one point, Clara broke her silence. "Why did you stop back there?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft but accusing. Lisa frowned. "Stop? I haven't stopped since we left." Clara didn't respond, but the temperature in the car dropped. Lisa checked the rearview mirror and gasped. The back seat was empty now, but for a moment she swore she'd seen someone sitting there, a shadowy figure barely illuminated by the dashboard lights. Panicking, Lisa decided to pull into a gas station to regroup, but the moment she exited the car, the station lights flickered and died. When they came back on, Clara was gone. Lisa searched frantically, but found no trace of her passenger. Returning to the car, she noticed something chilling. Clara's phone was still on the seat, though she hadn't brought one out earlier. The screen was cracked, displaying a single message: "You're next." Lisa contacted the rideshare company, trying to report Clara. The representative hesitated, confused. "Are you sure that's the name? Because there hasn't been a Clara registered for over a year." Dumbfounded, Lisa searched online and discovered an old news article. A woman named Clara was killed in a car accident along the same stretch of highway a year ago while using the same rideshare app. The story noted that her body was never recovered, only her personal items, including a phone, which matched the one Lisa now had. Determined to end this nightmare, Lisa resolved to finish the drive, hoping to leave the eerie presence behind. But Clara returned, appearing in the reflection of the rearview mirror, in the windows, even in the shadows of the roadside trees. She was no longer silent. "You've taken my place," she whispered. "The road doesn't forget." Lisa felt like she was losing her mind. Her car seemed to take on a life of its own, veering off course despite her grip on the wheel. She screamed as the headlights illuminated a horrifying sight: a dozen ghostly figures lining the roadside, their faces pale and lifeless, all watching her with hollow eyes. At the front of the group stood Clara, her expression blank but accusing. She pointed at Lisa, and the car engine sputtered, then died completely. Trapped, Lisa grabbed Clara's phone, scrolling desperately for clues. She found a series of unsent messages: pleas for help, coordinates to an unknown location, and a final message that read, "It's your turn to pay the toll." The road began to shift, the asphalt cracking and falling away into an endless abyss. Lisa ran from the car, but the spectral figures followed, their voices a haunting cacophony of blame. Clara appeared in front of her, pointing down the highway. "Keep driving, or stay with us forever." Lisa woke up in her car, parked at the side of the road, the morning sun rising over the horizon. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare. But when she looked at her dashboard, she froze. Her rideshare app was open, displaying a new request. Passenger, Lisa. Destination, unknown. She turned to the passenger seat, where Clara's cracked phone rested, glowing faintly. In the reflection of the screen, Lisa saw her own face, pale, lifeless, and staring back at her, as if she no longer belonged in the world of the living. The story ends with another driver pulling over at a rest stop, picking up a lone, silent hitchhiker standing in the shadows. During their cross-country road trip, Dan and Rachel, a young couple, prided themselves on taking the unbeaten path. They had planned their route meticulously, steering clear of crowded highways and opting for scenic backroads that promised adventure. On the second night, as twilight descended, their GPS unexpectedly lost signal. Unfazed, Dan decided to follow an old paper map Rachel had insisted on packing. The road grew narrower and more desolate, surrounded by dense, looming trees that seemed to close in on them. As night fully claimed the sky, their car radio crackled to life. This was strange since it had been off. A distorted, staticky voice broke the silence, repeating the words, "Turn back before it's too late." Rachel's laugh was nervous, probably just picking up interference, she said. But neither of them could explain why the words kept repeating, each time growing louder and clearer. When they reached a fork in the road, the signal abruptly died. Dan chose the left path, reasoning it was the more traveled route based on the tire marks. But as they drove, the radio blared back to life, now screaming, "You're going the wrong way!" The road ahead turned treacherous, the surface riddled with cracks and overgrown vegetation. Dan and Rachel's nerves were fraying as the car's headlights barely illuminated what lay ahead. Out of nowhere, a sign appeared, a rusted, barely legible marker reading, "Fallow Ridge, 10 miles." The name didn't appear on their map or GPS. Worse, the farther they drove, the quieter the world became. No crickets, no wind, not even the hum of their engine seemed normal. Rachel checked her phone and gasped. Her battery, previously at 80%, had drained to 1%. Then they saw it, a faint flickering light ahead, as if someone was signaling with a lantern. Relieved, they thought it might be a house or someone who could give directions. As they pulled closer, the light vanished, leaving behind an abandoned, overgrown gas station. Inside the station was a single payphone. It began to ring. Dan hesitated, but picked it up. A chilling voice whispered, "You can't escape. It's too late." Rachel screamed as the car doors slammed shut on their own. The headlights flickered, and the radio turned itself back on, now playing a garbled news broadcast. Authorities continue to search for the couple last seen on Route 17. Their car was found abandoned at Fallow Ridge. Dan froze. That couldn't be them. They had just arrived. But Rachel noticed the air around them had grown thick, almost suffocating, as if the forest itself was alive and watching. Desperate, they decided to backtrack. But no matter how far they drove, every turn led them back to the gas station. Each time, the scene grew more twisted. Rust-red handprints smeared across the station's windows, and shadowy figures standing in the tree line, unmoving but inching closer every time the couple looked away. Digging through the car for clues, Rachel found an old newspaper stuffed in the glove compartment. The headline read, "Fatal Accident Claims Lives on Fallow Ridge. Locals blame the cursed signal." The article detailed a couple, strikingly similar to Dan and Rachel, who had driven into the woods and were never seen again. Convinced they were caught in some supernatural loop, Dan and Rachel decided to walk. But as they ventured into the forest, the temperature plummeted. Fog rolled in, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. Then came the whispers, faint at first, but soon echoing all around them. "Turn back before it's too late." But they had no choice. Going back to the car wasn't an option. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, with paths forming and disappearing before their eyes. Rachel spotted a figure ahead, someone waving for them to follow. Desperate, they chased after it, only to find themselves at the edge of a cliff, overlooking a dark, swirling void. The figure turned, revealing a grotesque, hollow face. It spoke in the same voice from the payphone. You ignored the warnings. You belong here now. The ground beneath them began to crack, and shadowy hands reached up from the void, clawing at their ankles. Dan grabbed Rachel, trying to pull her back, but her screams were drowned by the deafening static filling the air. The next morning, a local search team found Dan's car parked by the old gas station. The engine was cold, and the interior was covered in frost despite the mild weather. The doors were locked, and no trace of Dan or Rachel was found. The radio, however, still played a distorted broadcast, repeating the same chilling message: turn back before it's too late. The story ends with a new couple planning a road trip, laughing off rumors about cursed back roads. The camera pans out to reveal their car driving down a desolate, tree-lined path. In the distance, a faint flickering light beckons them forward.